The UN, mankind's last and best hope for peace, or a world socialist government in the making. After World War II, or actually during World War II, the plans were laid to form this United Nations, and a war-weary world established it as mankind's last and best hope for peace. There was very little opposition in the U.S. Senate. Only 2 senators voted against it. I'm going to hopefully be able to convince those folks who may be viewing this or in the audience today that the UN we need to take a second look at it and perhaps re-examine our commitment, and as you see on the banner in the front of the podium, what you should get out of the UN. Before I do, I want to use recommended reading. And I suggest that those of you who are viewing, take your pencils and pens out, and I'll be giving a lot of documentation. I'm not making anything up. This isn't speculation or, as an op-ed piece that appeared in a recent newspaper in the South Shore, kooky theories. I am backing everything up with facts. And may I add, there are plenty of kooky theories out there, but you won't find any tonight. One thing that we publish is the New American Magazine. It's a bi-weekly magazine, and we recently did a special issue on the United Nations. And I strongly urge that you get a copy of this and see for yourself the documentation in this. Also, a book that came out a few years ago called Global Tyranny, Step by Step by William Jasper. Mr. Jasper is an interesting individual. In the late 60s, he was attending a college in Idaho, University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho. And he went to a college fair where he saw a table that had a banner that read much like this one, "Get us out of the UN." This was in the height of the anti-war demonstration, the Vietnam War, and all the tables were from these little different left-wing groups, and in the middle of them was this one lone John Bircher with a little table with some information and a banner that said, "Get us out of the UN." Well, Bill Jasper said, "This is outrageous. Who would ever dream of doing something like that?" So he went to scold this poor fellow, and the guy said, "Well, look, I'll tell you what. He said, here's a book I want you to read. Read the book, then come up to me and tell me what you think." Well, he read the book. 2 years of soul searching. I mean, he just read he wasn't convinced by one book. He researched the documentation that was in the book, and 2 years later, he became full circle. And now he's authoring books like Global Tyranny, and he's a very articulate spokesman to one of the persons that has been appearing on radio shows and TV shows, and authoring columns and writing books about the dangers of the UN. A recent book by John McManus, the president of the John Birch Society Changing Commands, details the United States military and how the plans are there to put our military under UN control. And we see that in headlines today. It's not new. It's nothing secret or kooky. It's absolutely very verifiable. Another book that was published right about the same time is called Freedom on the Altar by William Grigg. This book goes into how the UN is trying to usurp the family, education through UNESCO, world population control, and a host of other things. So I suggest that you get these books. You can get them at the library or contact us at the end of the program if you want to learn more about them. A little bit of history of the UN in order to put it in perspective. It was founded, the founding conference was in San Francisco, June of 1945. The first acting secretary of the UN was Alger Hiss, who at that time was a State Department official. Several years later, it was discovered that Alger Hiss was a Soviet agent, and he was found guilty of lying under oath and spent a few years in jail. And there are those people who still defend him, that he was innocent. But the facts are irrefutable. One of the persons that wanted to prove him innocent was a man by the name of Weinstein, I believe, who wrote a book. He said, "I am going to prove this man innocent." And as he was doing his research, he came to the conclusion this man is guilty as can be. And he published the book nevertheless. He was an honest liberal who simply took the facts and laid them out in front of the American people. There were about 17 or 18 other prominent people at the UN founding, American delegates, who were all members of the Communist Party. One of them had to flee to Eastern Europe to avoid prosecution. His name was Noel Field. I had a chance to meet his nephew not too long ago, who's sympathetic to us, and he admitted that his nephew or his uncle was a State Department Red. Among them, of course, were a number of people who were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. There were about 45 members of the Council on Foreign Relations also at this founding meeting, all, of course, American citizens. some of the general secretaries of the UN reads like a rogues gallery. Now, let me mention a few of them. Trygve Lie, who was a Norwegian socialist, who was actually a supporter of Stalin. U Thant from Burma. U Thant was on record as saying that the UN Charter is compatible to Lenin's desires. And he said this approvingly. He wasn't condemning that. Kurt Waldheim, a Nazi, was also a general secretary of the UN. The John Birch Society exposed Kurt Waldheim back in the early 70s. But it wasn't until he decided to run for president of Austria that the world learned of his Nazi past. A lot of people will say to me, well, if we had a UN, there wouldn't be a World War II. Really? You had a Nazi leading the UN. Could a Nazi lead the UN sometime in the near future? Well, the answer, of course, is yes. The UN Charter. I have a copy of it. We published a copy of it some years ago. The UN Charter is the exact opposite of the United States Constitution and our Declaration of Independence. The two are incompatible, totally incompatible. Our Constitution did not give us rights. It did not. The government wasn't established to give people rights. It was established to protect what we call God-given or natural rights. The UN Charter is just the opposite. It grants rights. It will, in one paragraph, it will say you have a right to do this or to do that, and the next paragraph qualify that right out of existence. And everything they published, their document or their charter, their numerous covenants, are replete with these such Orwellian doublespeak, if you will. The Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was recently ratified by the United States Senate several years ago, which in itself is a scandal, I believe, when we knew that there were only five senators present on record, yet they ratified this in the name of the United States of America. Article 18 says that everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right shall include freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his choice, and freedom either individually or in community with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in worship, observance, practice, and teaching. That sounds pretty good. Who would be against that? Of course, nobody would be. Well, let's go down to paragraph 3. Freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, order, health, or morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. Well, guess what? You just lost those rights. You look at China today, that viciously persecutes those who disagree with the state. They look at that and say, we have no problems with that because we can turn that away anytime we wish. Article 19. Everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art or through any other media of his choice. Get down to section 3. The exercise of the rights provided for in paragraph 2 of this article carries with it special duties and responsibilities. It may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law and are necessary. Isn't that nice? They also go on to talk about open trials. So we have in our Constitution, we have Article 6, or Amendment 6, that says we have the right to a trial by jury, a speedy trial. And not by speedy trial, I don't mean a 10-minute trial like Soviet style and you're sent to the Gulag for 15 years. It says you have the right to a trial, but an open trial. But if we want, it may be subject only to such limitations as prescribed by law. So secret trials are upheld by the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Yet our senators ratified that, and it doesn't take a political science major to look at that and say, hey, what a great escape clause. Yet when we point this out, some people say, oh, that's nonsense, that's kooky, that's bizarre thinking. Well, it's right there in black and white. It can't be more obvious. You see, there's a treaty right now, the Treaty on the Child, the Covenant on the Child. They will say, what do you mean? You don't want to help the children of the world? Well, of course we do. And it's been done most of the time by free people, by families. But look at some of the nations that have already signed this. Look at Sudan, where there's slaves. They actually have slaves in Sudan, slave trade, children as slaves. The UN doesn't seem to worry about Sudan. You look at Russia. Russia signed it. Boris Yeltsin recently sent some of his troops into Chechnya, and they bombed an orphanage. The UN didn't seem to mind. There was no outrage. There was no demonstrations around the country. The campuses of this country were pretty quiet. Nobody seemed to worry about it. And some of those bombs may have been as a result of our foreign aid, to the tune of billions of dollars. You people out here have helped that Chechen invasion. Indirectly. I'm sure nobody here would want to advocate that. I don't care what your political views are. But it did happen, and it's going on today. So again, it's very important to understand our Constitution was designed to protect rights, God-given rights, so natural rights. It wasn't designed to take rights away from us. The UN Charter gives rights and then takes them away in the next paragraph. It's interesting to note that the UN Charter is also not a peacemaking entity, but a war-making entity. And you look at sections 43 onward, and you see how the framework for a global army is prescribed for. It also tells you in the very beginning that the very preamble that only peace-loving nations can belong. Well, you know some nations that belong who aren't peace-loving. And I'm sure there's some folks out there who are liberal folks who say that we're not a peace-loving nation. And I think there's a big ring of truth to that as well. So should we get out? Yeah, I think so. The Korean War was probably the first time UN soldiers, or I should say nations of the world, fought under a UN banner. And a lot of people say at least they did something right here. Well, that is a mistake to believe that. General Douglas MacArthur had a marvelous victory at the Incheon Landing back in 1951, I believe. And the war was won at that point. He drove the North Koreans completely out of Korea. But what happened was that they changed the policies. He was fired. He was replaced by Matthew Ridgway, and the rules of engagement changed dramatically. We were no longer, since that time, the United States military was no longer allowed to fight independently, no win. General MacArthur realized that the enemy seemed to have his plans after the Incheon invasion. They seemed to know exactly what he was doing, when he was doing it, how he was doing it. And he didn't really know why. Well, we do know why. At Yalta, 1945, at that meeting at Yalta, there was a secret agreement between Roosevelt and Stalin. And at that meeting, it was agreed that the UN, that the Undersecretary for Political and Security Council Affairs would always be a Soviet national. With two exceptions, it's always been that way. So in other words, the person that was in charge of the overall military operations of the UN, the Korean War, was a Soviet national. So do you think he was filtering information to Stalin? Of course he was. We're told that Stalin was asleep at the switch because prior to the vote for going to war, the Russians boycotted the assembly, the Permanent Security Council. Now, Permanent Security Council is made up of nations: China, at that time it was still Taiwan, or Free China, France, England, the United States, and Russia. These are the permanent members of this committee. And Russia boycotted because we wouldn't seat Communist China. That's what we're told. Now, obviously, the Russians knew that they were voting. And if the Russians did not want us to fight under the UN banner, I'm sure they would have voted no. That's simple. So it's apparent that they wanted us to fight under a UN banner. And we're still paying for that price today. And I dare say that if there was no Korean War, there would be no Vietnam. There may not have been a bloody purge in mainland China. In fact, our best ally in World War II, Chiang Kai-shek, wanted to go into China. He had a large army, and he had every reason to do so. And we said no. Instead, we sent our troops over there. 55,000 plus died. Thousands more suffered, came home with scars. Some of them perished in concentration camps, POW camps. And there's 6,000 of them were gunned down, were murdered. 6,000 soldiers were murdered in a massacre. Very much unreported massacre of American soldiers. General Clark, when he signed the truce, he said, "I have the dubious distinction of being the first military officer in the history of the United States that signed a stalemate." And we're still paying for that war today. Something quite brutal in the early 60s. these wonderful peacekeepers of the UN, these wonderful people who want brotherhood and world peace, went into the province of Katanga. Katanga no longer exists. It's been swept under an Orwellian memory hole. And I was hoping to have some film clippings of what happened in Katanga. A little background on that first. The Belgian Congo became independent of Belgium, and it was led by a communist by the name of Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba was so well respected by the Soviets that they named a school in his honor, which is still there today, I understand, the Patrice Lumumba University, that trains black Africans for social agitation and revolution. A lot of the world's Marxist-Leninists, third world countries attended that. Lumumba was assassinated during turmoil, and the leader of Katanga, Mose Shombe, a pro-Western Christian leader, decided to secede from chaos. He wanted nothing to do with the central government, so he seceded. Now, the UN went into Katanga and launched a bloodthirsty war against the peaceful, loving province of Katanga. Now, Katanga, I don't recall what the population was, but they had some things there that may have been of interest. They had uranium, plutonium. They had a healthy economy. They had free market and capitalism. They had a mixed population. They had Jews, Gentiles, blacks, Europeans, and they all got along pretty well. It was probably a shiny example of how freedom can really exist. So Shombe was kidnapped, taken out of power, and eventually he was murdered several years later. There was a book written by 46 doctors. It's called the 46 Angry Doctors. And they were pro-UN. They were sympathetic to the UN. And what they saw so disgusted them. They saw UN soldiers raping women. They saw UN planes bombing hospitals, bombing post offices, and engaging in carnage. And they petitioned the world's leaders, President Kennedy, the Pope, all the world leaders of the world, in the name of God, stop this. And what was the world's answer? More funding for more carnage. One of the leaders of this fiasco was an Irish general, Cruz O'Connor. And he was very proud of that. He was very proud of the fact that he was involved in that. But there was a reporter who was now an ambassador to Kenya, Smith Hempstone, I believe, who was not so proud of it. He was deeply disgusted by what was going on. I happen to have a friend of mine who was also involved in that. And it's quite interesting that you can read books and you could see videotapes, but when you have a first-hand experience, it seems to mean more. And he said that he was a young Air Force NCO, and his job was he was a cargo plane personnel, crewman. And he said he was following orders. He didn't kill anybody. He simply brought the ammunition and the food and the supplies that were used, and he saw what happened. He was horrified and shocked. And he thought, now we need to get out of the UN. It was because a few years later, when he got out of the military, he found the John Birch Society. He's been an active member ever since. Well, that was one shining example of UN peacekeeping in action. A few years later, there was a country called Rhodesia, no longer called Rhodesia anymore. Now, Rhodesia was a nation that had a relatively small white population, a white-ruled country. 2 tribes made up the population. A lot of reforms were happening. A lot of progress was going on. But that wasn't good enough for these global masters. Rhodesia seceded from the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, and the UN slapped a sanctimonious embargo on Rhodesia, and of course the United States participated in that as well, and destroyed that country, and did not lift those sanctions and that embargo until the more bloodiest of the 3 rebel factions came to power. The country is now called Zimbabwe. It is a hardline Marxist-Leninist dictatorship. I think the per capita income of the poor people who live there is like $500 a year. It is a hellhole, and the UN helped to bring that hellhole about. South Africa is another case in point. South Africa, a nation of at least 20 tribes, black tribes, a white tribe, actually 2 white tribes if you look at the English and the Dutch as distinct tribes. The highest standard of living in Africa, in all of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, was South Africa. Great progress was made to do away with apartheid, to just embetter the blacks who were living there, but it wasn't enough for these global masters. the UN had another embargo against that nation, while it was supporting, again, the more militant forces, the African National Congress, that engaged in such things as the necklace, where they set people on fire by putting a tire around them, putting gasoline in and setting them on fire. We have videotapes of this, where they're very proud of how they engage in this. We supported this. The UN supported this. Prior to the ANC coming to power under Nelson Mandela, the ANC had observation status at the UN. It seems to me that there is what they call politically correct terrorists. Another terrorist that's very popular with the UN people is a man named Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat, his hands drip with blood. His whole life he has been engaging in violence, bloodshed, murder, mayhem. People remember the Olympics, I think it was the 72 Olympics, where his goons went in and killed those Israeli athletes. Yasser Arafat is probably the world's renowned terrorist and also anti-Semite. Yet his PLO enjoyed observation status, and now, of course, he's carved out a little chunk of Israel, and he was recently invited to the White House. Politically correct terrorist, and the UN has always been supportive of Yasser Arafat. We see selective indignation. The UN has a history of selective indignation. They say nothing about the rape of Tibet, the brutal invasion of Afghanistan. But Taiwan is a country that they won't have nothing to do with. In the late 70s, I believe it was 1978, the UN decided to break, no, I'm sorry, it was earlier than that, I think it was 73. The UN decided to break all ties with Taiwan and recognize Mao Zedong's Red China. Red China is probably the history's most bloodthirsty regime. They estimate between 45 to 80 million people have been murdered under the communist regime, and it still goes on today, including forced abortion. People in this country who call themselves pro-choice should be appalled by the fact of China's one-child-per-family policy. And if you happen to get your wife pregnant, well, guess what? And you already have a child, and the government, Big Brother, didn't approve, that child is destroyed. And they seem to get very much beloved by the UN leaders. In fact, when the vote was taken to oust Taiwan, the UN officials were dancing in the street, dancing in the aisles, gloating, with delightful about this. That is the UN. I mentioned Afghanistan. Not one voice was raised in the UN against Afghanistan, against what was happening in Afghanistan. Several million people were murdered and killed. Booby-trapped toys were dropped on the Afghani countryside, where children were the target. That, of course, was thanks to the man of the decade, Comrade Gorbachev, who is now living in a little villa at a little place in San Francisco, the Presidium. Because you see, he has the Gorbachev Foundation, and they're looking to him, Gorbachev, to head the global Green Army, if and when this comes about. These are the kind of people that UN seems to really like. Several years ago, there was a conference down in Rio de Janeiro, and it was an environmental conference. And guess who got the biggest applause of all the speakers there? It was Fidel Castro. They were just giddy with delight when this Fidel Castro got up, denounced the United States, denounced how evil we are and how evil capitalism is. Then he wants to know why we don't lift the sanctions against him, and so he can trade with us, you see. As evil as we are, he still wants to get our money. Castro also has a love affair with the UN, and Castro had sent his troops practically all over the world. There was a joke about the great Cuban empire, that its population lives in Miami, its army is in Africa, and its government is in Moscow, and its money comes out of New York. And that is in some cases true. Yeah, Fidel Castro sent mainly white troops into black Africa to kill black Africans, but the UN didn't seem to mind. No protest. Actually, Castro sent some of his soldiers to torture Americans in POW camps in Vietnam. But somehow no one seemed to mind. No one in the UN seemed to really get upset about that. In 1990, the United States sent 500,000 troops into the Gulf War to build what George Bush referred to as the New World Order. The crucible of the New World Order was the invasion. We were first told that we had to go over there because we had to keep the oil from flowing. Prior to that, George Bush just closed up all exploration of the northeast Atlantic seaboard. He's locked up Alaska. It's been locked up for many, many years. Yet he told the American people that we had to do it for oil. Then it was jobs. Then he let the cat out of the bag and said the New World Order. That's the real reason. And George Bush also said that in a speech that he gave to the American people that we are finally have a UN as envisioned by its founders. Not many people asked George Bush who were the UN founders. People like Alger Hiss, Owen Lattimore, Victor Perlow, and many others who were very unsavory characters. No one seemed to ask Mr. Bush that. No one seemed to ask Mr. Bush that the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the authorization to wage war. And George Bush said the UN is a higher authority. He was incorrect from that, and that really should have been an impeachable offense, but it wasn't. And a lot of people and good Americans supported that effort. And of course, when American soldiers are being fired upon, it's our nature to support them, of course. But they should have never happened. Should have never happened. We should have never been over there to begin with. Then it was Somalia, nation building. No one tells you that the dictator that was leading Somalia, that drove that nation to the ground, was supported by the UN time and time again, or by their lending agencies, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, etc. Then, of course, there was the case of Haiti. Haiti has, since its independence from France, way back in the early 1800s, has always been an unstable government, unfortunately. Baby Doc Duglier and Papa Doc, who have been longtime beneficiaries of the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, a UN entities. And there was a Marxist-Leninist person who got elected, Aristide, and he was overthrown, came to the United States. He spent a career denouncing the United States, praising people like Castro. But he came over here and he was given a nice apartment in Washington, D.C. and all kinds of money. And American soldiers, Green Berets actually, were used to reinstall this man. Is there something wrong with the United States military being used to install or reinstall a Marxist-Leninist, a person who despises the United States? Is there something wrong with that? Is it kooky, bizarre, wacky to suggest that there's something wrong with that we had no business doing that? Yeah, I think so. The latest UN mess is in Bosnia. Bosnia, it would take me 5 hours to discuss what's happening in Bosnia, and it's so confusing that most people who are over there don't know what's going on. But the history of Bosnia, we can go back to World War II, Yugoslavia. The United States State Department betrayed one of our allies to Tito, Joseph Tito, in Yugoslavia. We support the Yugoslavian communist regime since the early 50s, giving them aid, trade, military hardware. And then, of course, with the what happened in the Soviet Union, there was a lot of upheaval, and civil war broke out. The first thing the UN did was slap an arms embargo, making those people, the Bosnians, defenseless against the Serbians. So it's a good argument that if they had the weapons, that perhaps the genocide would not have even have happened. And now right now we're using U.S. naval or U.S. jets over there, bombing strongholds. We have no business over there to begin with. It's terrible what's happening, but we cannot be the policemen of the world. Yet we are the policemen of the world. The U.S. Constitution does not specify that. There's a local talk show out of the Boston area called the Howie Carr Show, WRKO. And shortly after the U.S. officer that was captured by the Serbians, shortly after his release, Howie Carr went to the radio airwaves and he said, "What are we doing? Why is this happening? What's going on here?" And I got a chance to call in, first time I ever called in a show. And I said, "Howie, this is the bottom line. In 1945, the United States signed a treaty, the United States Senate ratified a treaty committing ourselves to the United Nations. And that's why we're over there. Plain and simple, cut and dry." And he didn't hang up on me. He said, "Okay, got your message." Little documentation. State Department document 7277 that was issued in 1961, September of 1961. This document dedicates or calls for putting our military under the complete control of the UN. 3 steps. First, they would sign treaties, they would disarm, and then stage number 3, step C. The manufacture of armaments would be prohibited except for those of agreed types and quantities to be used by the UN Peace Force. and those required to maintain internal order. All other armaments would be destroyed or converted to peaceful purposes. It's quite interesting. All other armaments. That just doesn't mean U.S. military, it means private citizens. How do you convert something to a peaceful purpose by the UN's definition? You take it out of the hand of a law-abiding American and put it into the hand of a UN soldier. That's a peaceful purpose. Some people, again, will scoff and ridicule this. They'll say it's silly, it's paranoia. Well, here it is right here. It's still available. We make it available. We published it. It's still part of the United States policy and explains that. Not too long ago, President Clinton established what he called PDD 25, Presidential Decision Directive 25. It was an update of PDD 13 that calls for the creation of a global army that would be headed by a UN commander. And the United States would have a large number of soldiers at the UN's disposal. Again, strict, totally unconstitutional. This appeared in the Washington Times last May. U.S. OK study of UN gun control. They use the word harmonize. They want to harmonize the world's gun laws. Now, what does that mean? That means the gun control laws in China would have to harmonize with those in our nation. The U.S. Constitution, of course, protects the right of free citizens to own weapons for self-defense, for whatever reason they want, whatever legal purpose they want. The U.S. Constitution has been misconstrued to say that a treaty supersedes the Constitution. And John Foster Dulles, State Department Secretary of State in the 50s under Eisenhower, said that a treaty supersedes the Constitution. And it is quite ridiculous to think that our founders got together and they gave us this wonderful Constitution that can be scrapped at the insistence of the President and 2/3 of the Senate. It is outrageous, but that is the misconception. Is it possible that a treaty can be drawn up? When they study something, they mean business. They don't sit around and drink coffee and tea and talk about the world's problems. They mean business. So when they come out and they start studying something, you can believe that not too far from the distant future, that there will be some proposal calling for world gun control. There was a survey taken last spring at the 29 Palms Marine Base in California. I have a copy of it. It was 46 questions. I'm not going to go over all 46 questions. This questionnaire was given to veterans of the Gulf War. And the first 10 or 20 questions just asked about their jobs and what they do as a Marine and so forth. And then they got into UN peacekeeping missions, drug enforcement, border patrol, and they really got down to business. Question 44. I would like UN member countries, including the U.S., to give the UN all the soldiers necessary to maintain world peace. Strong disagree, etc. Question 45. I would swear to the following code. I am a United Nations fighting person. I serve in the forces which maintain world peace and every nation's way of life. I am prepared to give my life in their defense. Strongly disagree, and so forth. Question 46. The U.S. government declares a ban on the possession, sale, transportation, and transfer of all non-sporting firearms. A 30-day amnesty period is permitted for these firearms to be turned over to local authorities. At the end of this period, a number of citizens groups refuse to turn over their firearms. Consider the following statement. I would fire upon U.S. citizens who refuse or resist confiscation of firearms banned by the U.S. government. Strong disagree, and so forth. Well, the results were, not exactly in our favor, because 1 out of every 4 Marines said they would fire upon U.S. soldiers. 3 out of the 4, of course, said they would not. And in fact, one of the Marines surveyed wrote in question 46, "Read none dare call a conspiracy." And the fellow who, Lieutenant Commander. That's it. I was in the Army, so forgive me. Lieutenant Commander Cunningham, who conducted this survey, had said that it looks like the John Birch Society has influenced the thinking of some of these Marines, and we want to thank him for mentioning us there. One of the Marines who took the survey was walking out, and his buddy said, "Hey, I got an extra copy." He said, "I want a copy, but I know where to send it." We had his aunt is a member of the Birch Society in California, and he has been reading our material, so he mailed it right to our magazine, and we broke the story. He has, I believe, since joined. He's out of the service now. He's now in Indianapolis, Indiana, and he recently attended a program of ours out there. About the same time, another very upsetting article appeared in this happened to be the Sacramento Bee. It reported an article that appeared in the Army War College magazine called Parameters, authored by Major Ralph Peters. Major Ralph Peters, and here's a copy of the article here, we're the warrior class. Major Ralph Peters said there is a new warrior class that we need to be concerned about, and he identified that. He said, the first group are those inner city people, inner city young males, disaffected, without any hope of ever getting anywhere. Second class, he said, were genuine patriots, motivated by ideology or personal loss. Does anybody fit that description in this room, or the audience, in the viewing audience? Yes. Now, how do you deal with these folks? His own words, irresistible violence. This man takes an oath to uphold the Constitution, yet he writes these kinds of things. And at this time he was a major. By now he's probably a one-star general for writing these kinds of comments. Not that long ago, and I believe it was in this library in Marshfield, there was an article that he authored, some other magazine, and I just wish I photocopied it. And he said it was entitled Lessons from Chechnya. Did he condemn Yeltsin's invasion of Chechnya, the brutality that was committed there? No. He basically said that there are things that we need to do in this country to prevent Chechens in this country. He didn't condemn Yeltsin. In fact, he sympathized with him. These are the kind of people who seem to be very well accepted in our military circles today. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have some problems. No question about it. I have some friends who are in the Green Berets, and they told me to a man that they would not engage in this type of activity. But they're the rank and file. They are not the general class. So we'll see what happens. Other arms of the UN, not really that well known, have caused a lot of destabilization, misery in the world. The World Bank and International Monetary Funds are these two arms that I'm going to mention. There was a book written by a man named Hancock, I forget his first name, The Lords of Poverty. He was an English journalist, a liberal too. He documents quite devastatingly how the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have been responsible for, or partially responsible for famines, for disasters, and for propping up some of the world's worst dictators. And it's just laced with documentation. Lords of Poverty. Again, this is a man who was initially sympathetic to their goals. And I mentioned a little earlier Haiti, how that was propped up. Somalia, another nation that was propped up by the World Bank. What happens is that the World Bank will go into a nation and they'll say, okay, we want to do business here, but you have to do what we say. So they have their little dictator, that little tin horn dictator that runs that country. The World Bank people do not really seem to care about human rights. They may every now and then make a little statement and try to think for public opinion, for world opinion purposes, but the money continues to flow. There was a little adage to define what foreign aid is. Foreign aid is when you take money from poor people in rich countries and give it to rich people in poor countries. And it goes a little bit beyond that, but I think that's a pretty good definition. One of the beneficiaries of foreign aid, or the World Bank especially, is a man named Sissoko in what was once called the Belgian Congo. He is perhaps one of the most wealthiest men in the world. And he became very wealthy because of his love affair with the World Bank. The people that live in his nation, Zaire, are extremely poor. It is a poverty-ridden nation and a despotic nation, but he still seems to be supported by the World Bank. The World Bank, 1/3 of all World Bank funding comes from two people in the audience, U.S. taxpayers. In Iraq, the Iraqi leader, propped up by the World Bank, by the United States taxpayer, and by the Russian government, Saddam Hussein. There probably would not have been a Saddam Hussein had it been for those several entities supporting his policies. Ethiopia is a good case in point. Ethiopia, with its horrible famines in the late 70s and 80s. And there were a lot of good people in this country. They had a concert for Ethiopia, and millions of dollars were raised to feed these poor folks. it was given, the money or the food was given, or the money was given to Ethiopian government, which was headed by a Marxist-Leninist dictator, Mengistu, who came to power in the late 70s. It wasn't because of drought that caused the famine. The Ethiopians have been farming that land for thousands of years. We make reference to the Ethiopians in the Old Testament. They know that there are famines, and there were years of famine. They store food. But you see, when you have a Marxist-Leninist calling the shots, when you store food, you're hoarding. You're an enemy of the people, and the food was destroyed. Populations were resettled. This is what caused the famine. And the people in this country, I think all of them very good, liberals, moderates, conservatives, who wanted to do something, but very little, if any, got into the right hands. One of our members is a former Ethiopian general, Solomon Beliti, and he was given orders to go into a town and destroy it, to wipe it out. And of course, he did not do that. He defected, and he came over to this country and sought out the Jumper Society. He's now an active member. He said that a lot of the food that he saw coming off the ships from this U.S., I think it was called U.S. Aid for Africa, We Are the World, that wonderful song that raised all kinds of money. He saw that food being taken off ships and being put on Eastern European ships, being swapped for guns and ammunition. He said he could document that. So all those good, well-intentioned people, they did not address the root cause. The root cause, of course, was a Marxist-Leninist dictatorship that probably wouldn't have happened without the World Bank. In fact, there was a meeting of the World Bank officials in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, and the UN General Assembly voted to fund to build a new building because they had inadequate facilities to the tune of something like $73 million. So these well-fed, spoiled UN bureaucrats could have luxury. And Mr. Hancock said that $73 million could have inoculated 1 million children in Ethiopia, could have built hundreds of wells, could have done a lot of good. Instead, it went to feed these fat UN bureaucrats who were totally indifferent to the sufferings of the people of Ethiopia. Is there enough evidence? I can go on for hours about the UN and discuss more and more. UNICEF, I remember as a child, trick-or-treating for UNICEF. Now, you miserable, evil John Bircher, how can you be against UNICEF? They help the world's children. Well, I want to see the world's children being helped. UNICEF, back in the late 60s when I was trick-or-treating, was supporting North Vietnam. Now, they weren't giving money to or food to the North Vietnamese children. They were giving it to the North Vietnamese government, and they decided to do what they did with it, whatever they wanted to do with it. See, they also supported some of the Rhodesian terrorists that were killing people, that were murdering people in Rhodesia. That is a proven fact that some of these captured guerrillas had UNICEF packages, thanks to the U.S. taxpayer and these children trick-or-treating for UNICEF. Has the UN ever did anything good? Yeah, I'm sure they have. Al Capone had soup kitchens, but he was still a notorious gangster. There's plenty of world relief organizations, private organizations that do enormous good work. And sometimes the UN takes credit for their work. One of the organizations is called Doctors Without Frontiers, a French-based organization. They were kicked out of Ethiopia, kicked out of other countries, because they don't like what's the UN policy. One of the things we're told that, well, okay, the UN is a problem, but what do we do? What do we replace it with? What do you recommend? You want to pull us out, become isolationists? And I like to quote an English statesman by the name of Richard Cobden, 19th century English statesman, who, by the way, was responsible for getting rid of a lot of the socialism in England at the time, the mercantilism. Richard Cobden said, peace will come to this world when its peoples have as much to do with each other, its governments the least. It must be pointed out that only governments can wage war and commit genocide. Adolf Hitler, as a paranoid paper hanger in Vienna, could do very little damage to the world. But with the power of government, he did quite a bit, didn't he? He helped launch a world war, killing millions of people because he had the force of government behind him. What if the UN had this kind of power, which they seek, and they do seek it? A global army, a global regime, global taxation, and a global currency. These are all things that they're advocating, all of which is well documented. Where will be the checks and balances? The United States is a nation with 5% of the world's population, but we have about half the world's wealth. What's in store for us with a UN, with a more empowered UN? Reform the UN. Well, I remember speaking to a Baptist Bible college, and someone told me that communism in theory is good, it just has to be run by the right people. And I count it with, it's like telling me hell is a good place to be as long as it was being run by the right demons. You cannot reform something that's intrinsically bad. What to replace it with? Well, if I had a cancerous tumor, I want that thing cut out. I would not want to replace it with anything else. We have ambassadors. In fact, we have ambassadors to almost every nation in the world. Their job is to establish relations with nations. That's the purpose of the ambassadors. Third-party negotiators can do much more than having the whole world air its problems. And here's a typical scenario. Let's suppose that there was an argument between a husband and a wife in a given neighborhood. Now, usually when there's an argument, some people settle it between themselves. Most wives and husbands work things out without going to anybody. Or if it gets so bad, they may reach out for counseling. Psychiatrist, family counselor, a priest, a minister, or a rabbi. It's by nature. And that's usually pretty much taken care of, although we do have a high divorce rate. That's regrettable. But what if, instead of going to a third party, they went to the neighborhood? They called in everybody in the neighborhood, and they said, okay, the wife gave her side of the story, the husband her side. What then? The whole issue is now a neighborhood issue. People take sides. Something that could have been settled in a very easy way has now become a neighborhood problem. Well, the UN does that on a world scale. A conflict between two nations can be settled with a third party. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt did it between Russia and China. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for it. We didn't need a UN then. We don't need a UN now. We can settle our differences without a UN. And in fact, since 1945, there's been actually hundreds of wars around the world. As we speak, as I speak, every continent, there is something going on. There is a war, a civil war. So our bottom line is we need to get out of the UN. Now, how do we do this? Well, first of all, we have to get this information in the hands of as many people as possible. We have to be able to convince our friends, our neighbors, and then our elected officials that we need to get us out. And we've been doing this for 36 years since the beginning of the Birch Society. And for a while, we were a voice crying in the wilderness. People laughed at us. People thought it was kind of foolish to even be alarmed by them. I recently received a fundraising letter from the United Nations Association of the United States. And this really pleased me to no end. And I'm going to read a portion of it. It was a 4-page letter. The first paragraph, dear friend, in quotation mark, get the U.S. out of the UN and the UN out of the U.S., close quote. For almost half a century now, this has been the war cry of a small but very vocal group of Americans. You know them, and so do I. They are the reactionary isolationists, the fringe right-wingers, the exemplars of what historian Richard Hofstadter has described as the paranoid style in American politics. These groups can lay claim to very little in the way of enduring accomplishments or even popular support. On the United Nations, for example, the polls demonstrate that an impressive majority of Americans continue to believe that the UN serves a useful purpose in the world. But in spite of all that, there is great joy today among the hardcore nativists and obstructionists of the right-wing fringe. So much for diversity at the UN. Why so? Because in the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives, today there exists more support than we have seen for many, many years for measures designed to weaken or terminate altogether our country's commitment to the United Nations. That must not happen. So these people are quite upset by the widespread influence that the Birch Society and other organizations are receiving. And I think it's quite possible to think in the next 10 years there will not be a UN. Maybe there won't be a UN in the United States. But it won't happen unless we get active. Again, we have all the tools, too. We have a nice little pamphlet that we've been circulating around the country. A dozen good reasons to get us out of the UN. We have the books that I just showed a little while ago, Changing Command by John McManus, Freedom on the Altar by William Grigg, Global Tyranny, Step by Step by William Jasper. We have videotapes, a lot of audio cassette tapes, and I think it's quite possible that with a well-informed American people, we can finally get out of this UN. It is not something that's inevitable. It's not something that we have to be in. It was a treaty that was signed by the U.S. Senate. It's a treaty that can be broken by the U.S. Senate. So I urge you to contact us at the end of the tape. There'll be a number there. You can contact us and get some of this information. I thank you for your attention, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you very much.